The gavel slams down with the force of 30 years of unchecked power, its brass head striking the mahogany bench like a judge's final word on justice itself. Federal Judge Beaumont Ashworth leans back in his leather chair, surveying his courtroom domain with the satisfaction of a monarch reviewing his subjects. The morning light filters through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors where hundreds of defendants have stood before his bench, most leaving with longer sentences than the law truly required. His eyes scan the defendant's table with barely concealed disgust, settling on the woman seated there with perfect posture despite the circumstances that should humble her. Everything about this moment feels routine to him. Another case, another conviction, another step in the well-oiled machine of justice he's constructed over decades of service. Another welfare case wasting the court's time, he announces, his voice carrying the authority of someone who's never been challenged in his own courtroom. Maybe try learning some respect before coming into my courtroom, girl. The words hang in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Court Clerk Meridian Blackwood's fingers pause over her keyboard, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She's witnessed this performance countless times, watching Judge Ashworth establish dominance from the very first exchange. The morning docket always starts this way, with a reminder of who holds power and who must submit to it. The woman in the defendant's chair doesn't flinch. Special Agent Indigo Crestwood sits perfectly straight, hands folded precisely in her lap, eyes fixed on the man who represents everything wrong with the system she's sworn to protect. 3 months of preparation have led to this moment. 3 months of studying his patterns, his prejudices, his systematic violation of constitutional rights. The hidden recording device tucked beneath her modest blazer captures every word, every sneer, every violation of due process that's about to unfold. "I understand the court's procedures, Your Honor," she responds, her voice carrying a tone that's neither submissive nor defiant, something else entirely that Judge Ashworth can't quite identify. "Do you now?" His eyebrows raise in mock surprise. "Because people like you usually—" He pauses mid-sentence. Something in her voice, her posture, the way she holds her pen with military precision, it's unsettling. Professional. Too professional for someone who supposedly needs a public defender, someone who should be intimidated by the majesty of federal court proceedings. Court Clerk Meridian Blackwood shuffles through papers with practiced efficiency, her movements designed to reinforce the judge's authority. "Your Honor, the defendant refuses to sign the plea agreement her attorney negotiated." Judge Ashworth's laugh contains no humor. "Of course she does. Let me guess. You think you know better than trained attorneys? Think you can outsmart the system?" Agent Crestwood reaches into her folder. Not the cheap manila envelope most defendants carry, stuffed with hastily photocopied documents and desperate appeals, but a leather portfolio that speaks of organization, preparation, purpose. Her fingers find a specific document. Timestamp 094722, case number 2024-3341. A recorded conversation between Judge Ashworth and private prison CEO Corbett Ironwood that would make headlines if it ever reached the right ears. "I'd like to file a motion under Federal Rule 42, Your Honor." The courtroom goes silent, not the natural pause of legal proceedings, but the sudden quiet that follows an unexpected thunderclap. Meridian Blackwood's fingers freeze over her keyboard. Prosecutor Garrison Pike looks up sharply from his phone, where he'd been scrolling through emails about tonight's golf game. Even Bailiff Thorne Whitlock shifts uncomfortably by the door, his hand instinctively moving toward the handcuffs on his belt. Federal Rule 42. Criminal contempt procedures. The kind of citation that separates trained legal professionals from civilians playing dress-up in a courtroom. Federal Rule 42? Judge Ashworth's voice climbs an octave. "You don't even know what jurisdiction you're in, do you? This is a state criminal matter, not some federal playground." Agent Crestwood opens the portfolio slightly, just enough for the hidden recording device to capture perfect audio of every word that follows. Every sneer, every constitutional violation, every moment of bias that federal prosecutors will later play for grand juries. The leather case contains more than legal documents. It holds 3 months of surveillance, financial records, communication intercepts, and evidence of a corruption network that reaches from this courtroom to corporate boardrooms to federal appellate chambers. She meets his gaze with steady eyes that have seen federal crime scenes, interrogated domestic terrorists, and stared down corruption in forms Judge Ashworth couldn't imagine. "I believe I understand the jurisdictional issues perfectly, Your Honor." The lock clicks twice on her briefcase, then silence. The federal courthouse in Montgomery, Alabama rises like a monument to justice deferred, its neoclassical columns supporting a facade that promises equality under law. Built in 1962, the same year federal marshals integrated the University of Alabama, The building carries the weight of civil rights history in every marble step. Agent Indigo Crestwood has studied this courthouse for 3 months, memorizing its rhythms, its patterns, its systematic failures. She arrived at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours before proceedings begin, observing the morning ritual of power. Security guards wave certain lawyers through metal detectors while subjecting others to thorough searches. Court clerks greet some attorneys with warm familiarity while treating others with bureaucratic coldness. The disparities aren't random. They follow patterns that would make a federal statistician weep. Her clothes are carefully chosen. A navy blazer that's professional but not expensive, slacks that suggest respect for the court without claiming membership in its elite circles. Everything about her appearance screams, defendant trying to look respectable, exactly what her federal investigation requires. The hidden recording device is FBI grade, designed for deep cover operations where agent safety depends on absolute concealment. Court Clerk Meridian Blackwood arrives at 7:15 a.m., her heels clicking against marble floors like a metronome of authority. She's held this position for 12 years, long enough to understand which cases deserve attention and which deserve expedited processing. Her smile is warm for certain attorneys, glacial for others. She nods to Prosecutor Garrison Pike as he strides through the courthouse doors, his confidence radiating the certainty of someone who hasn't lost a case in this courtroom for 18 months. Morning docket looks light today, Pike tells her, adjusting his tie. Should be done by lunch. Blackwood glances at her computer screen. Mostly pleas and sentencing, nothing that should slow us down. Agent Crestwood watches this exchange from her position near the public seating, noting the casual dismissal of constitutional rights hidden beneath administrative efficiency. Every plea negotiated under this system carries the implicit threat of Judge Ashworth's courtroom, where challenging authority brings swift and harsh consequences. Defense attorney Remington Cross enters at 7:45 a.m., his shoulders already slumped with defeat. He carries a battered briefcase and the expression of someone who's learned to manage client expectations downward. His track record in Judge Ashworth's courtroom reads like a study in systematic failure. Plea agreements that favor prosecutors, sentences that exceed guidelines, appeals that die in procedural mazes. Ms. Crestwood? Cross approaches her with the weary politeness of someone fulfilling professional obligations. I'm your appointed counsel. We should discuss your options before court begins. She studies him carefully. Everything about Cross suggests competence beaten down by systemic resistance. His legal knowledge seems solid, his intentions apparently genuine, but his spirit has been broken by years of watching justice denied. He's exactly the kind of attorney Judge Ashworth prefers to work with, someone who won't fight too hard when the fix is in. I've reviewed the case files, she tells him. I have concerns about the evidence collection procedures. Cross blinks in surprise. Most defendants want to talk about sentence reductions, not constitutional violations in evidence gathering. The search warrant appears to be in order. I don't see grounds for suppression. Federal standards for probable cause require— This is state court, Cross interrupts gently. Different standards apply. Agent Crestwood nods, filing away his response. Either Cross doesn't understand federal preemption of constitutional rights, or he's been trained to avoid complications that might anger Judge Ashworth. Both possibilities will matter when federal prosecutors evaluate his role in this system. Bailiff Thorne Whitlock enters at 8 a.m. sharp, his uniform crisp and his demeanor suggesting military background. He surveys the courtroom with practiced eyes, noting potential problems, escape routes, threats to court security. His gaze lingers on Agent Crestwood. Something about her posture, her awareness, her controlled breathing suggests training beyond civilian experience. All rise, Whitlock announces as Judge Ashworth emerges from his chambers. The Honorable Beaumont Ashworth has presided over this courtroom for 32 years, appointed by a president who valued tough-on-crime credentials over constitutional sensitivity. His black robe flows behind him like shadows of every harsh sentence he's imposed, every constitutional right he's trampled, every life he's destroyed in service of private prison profits. He settles into his chair with the satisfaction of absolute power. The American flag to his right and state flag to his left frame his position like symbols of divided loyalty. Behind him, law books gather dust while real legal decisions get made through phone calls to private prison executives and campaign donors. Court is now in session, Judge Ashworth announces. Let's dispense with the morning's business efficiently. I have lunch plans that won't wait for legal theatrics. The first case involves a young black man charged with drug possession. The evidence consists of a traffic stop that escalated to a vehicle search based on suspicious behavior, code words that turn constitutional rights into suggestions. Defense attorney Cross offers no meaningful challenge to questionable probable cause. Prosecutor Pike presents evidence with the mechanical efficiency of someone reading from a script. Guilty, Judge Ashworth announces before the defendant fully understands his options. 18 months, State Correctional Facility. Agent Crestwood watches this constitutional violation unfold with clinical detachment, documenting every procedural failure, every due process denial, every moment that federal civil rights law should intervene. Her recording device captures it all, evidence for the federal pattern or practice investigation that will ultimately determine Judge Ashworth's fate. The second case involves a Hispanic woman charged with welfare fraud. Her crime consists of failing to report temporary employment while receiving assistance, a paperwork violation that Judge Ashworth treats like major theft. Her public defender offers the same defeated performance Cross had given moments earlier. 12 months, Judge Ashworth decides. Maybe this will teach your client about honesty. Each case follows the same pattern. Defendants of color receive harsh sentences for minor infractions while white defendants receive probation for similar charges. The disparities aren't subtle. They're stark enough to constitute federal civil rights violations, clear enough to justify Department of Justice intervention. This story gets darker than you think. What happens when corruption runs this deep in our justice system? You won't believe how this FBI agent's investigation unfolds. Like this video if you're ready for the truth and let me know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed bias in a courtroom? Subscribe for more shocking true stories that expose the reality behind closed doors. Agent Crestwood's case comes third on the docket. The charges stem from an alleged drug possession incident that occurred during a traffic stop, except every detail about that stop was carefully orchestrated by federal investigators to create probable cause for this undercover operation. The drugs were FBI property. The arrest coordinated with local police who believed they were participating in a joint task force investigation. State versus Crestwood. Prosecutor Pike announces with the same mechanical efficiency he's brought to every case. Defendant is charged with possession with intent to distribute. Judge Ashworth examines the file with cursory attention. I see the defendant has refused a very generous plea agreement. How do you plead? Agent Crestwood stands slowly, her movements controlled and precise. Everything about this moment has been rehearsed, but the reality carries weight that no training exercise could simulate. She's about to place herself at the mercy of a corrupt system while secretly documenting its failures. Not guilty, Your Honor. The words hang in the courtroom air like a challenge to established order. Judge Ashworth's eyebrows climb toward his hairline. Defendants in his courtroom don't typically reject plea agreements, especially not defendants who look like Agent Crestwood, especially not for drug charges that carry mandatory minimum sentences. Not guilty? His voice carries genuine surprise. Ms. Crestwood, your attorney has negotiated a plea that would result in time served and supervised probation. You're rejecting that to face a potential 10-year federal sentence? I believe I have the right to trial by jury, Your Honor. Prosecutor Pike shuffles through papers with sudden urgency. This isn't following the script. Defendants are supposed to accept plea agreements gratefully, especially when facing the alternative of Judge Ashworth's sentencing creativity. The whole system depends on fear overcoming constitutional rights. You have rights, Judge Ashworth concedes with barely concealed irritation, but you also have responsibilities. The responsibility not to waste this court's time with frivolous challenges to legitimate law enforcement. Agent Crestwood reaches for her portfolio again, retrieving a document that makes Pike's eyes widen. It's a motion to suppress evidence, not the amateur legal work most pro se defendants attempt, but professional-grade constitutional arguments citing relevant case law and federal precedents. I'm filing a motion to suppress evidence obtained in violation of Fourth Amendment protections, she announces. The courtroom temperature seems to drop 10 degrees. Defense attorney Cross stares at his client with the expression of someone watching a train derailment in slow motion. Blackwood's fingers hover over her keyboard, uncertain how to categorize this unprecedented development. Whitlock shifts his weight, hand moving unconsciously toward his weapon. Judge Ashworth takes the document with movements that suggest physical pain. His eyes scan the legal citations, the constitutional arguments, the federal case law that supports every claim. This isn't the work of someone playing legal dress-up. This is the product of serious legal training. Ms. Crestwood, he begins slowly, did you write this motion yourself? I did, Your Honor. And where exactly did you receive your legal education? The question hangs between them like a blade. Agent Crestwood meets his gaze with steady eyes, revealing nothing about the federal law enforcement training, the constitutional law courses, the civil rights investigation experience that prepared her for this moment. I've studied the relevant statutes, Your Honor. It's not a lie, but it's not the complete truth. She's studied more than statutes. She's memorized federal investigation protocols, constitutional precedents, civil rights enforcement procedures. Her legal education includes FBI Academy training, Department of Justice seminars, and federal court experience that dwarfs anything in Judge Ashworth's background. Speaking of evidence gathering, protecting your digital privacy has never been more critical. With ExpressVPN, you can ensure your online activities remain private and secure, just like professional investigators protect their digital footprints. ExpressVPN encrypts your data with military-grade security, hiding your IP address from prying eyes. Whether you're researching sensitive topics or simply browsing, ExpressVPN keeps you protected across all devices. Get 3 months free when you sign up for a 12-month plan. Use our link below and take control of your digital security today. Judge Ashworth studies the suppression motion with the expression of someone discovering termites in supposedly solid wood. Every legal citation is correct, every constitutional argument sound, every procedural point precisely targeted at the weakest elements of the prosecution's case. This level of legal sophistication doesn't emerge from casual study. It requires training, experience, professional expertise. This motion raises complex federal constitutional issues. He admits reluctantly, issues that typically require extensive briefing and research. Prosecutor Pike clears his throat with obvious discomfort. Your Honor, the state objects to any delay in proceedings. This appears to be a dilatory tactic designed to... The defendant has the right to challenge illegally obtained evidence. Agent Crestwood interrupts quietly. Federal courts have consistently held that Fourth Amendment violations require suppression regardless of... Federal courts? Judge Ashworth's voice climbs dangerously. Ms. Crestwood, this is my courtroom, not some federal playground where activist judges coddle criminals. We follow state procedures here. The words reveal more than Judge Ashworth intended. His hostility toward federal oversight, his dismissal of constitutional protections, his view of defendants as presumed criminals, all captured by the recording device that will eventually play these statements for Department of Justice prosecutors. With respect, Your Honor, the Constitution applies in every American courtroom. The silence that follows carries the weight of 30 years of unchallenged authority meeting unexpected resistance. Judge Ashworth has built his reputation on intimidating defendants into submission, on creating an atmosphere where constitutional rights wither under judicial hostility. Defendants who challenge him typically back down quickly when faced with the threat of enhanced sentences. But Agent Crestwood doesn't back down. She sits perfectly straight, hands folded, meeting his glare with calm professionalism that suggests either remarkable courage or dangerous naivety. The hidden recording device captures every micro-expression, every moment of bias that federal investigators will later analyze for patterns of constitutional violation. Bailiff Whitlock, Judge Ashworth commands, remove any recording devices from this courtroom. I won't have my proceedings turned into some kind of media circus. Whitlock moves through the gallery with practiced efficiency, checking phones, cameras, anything that might document what happens next. He approaches Agent Crestwood's seat with particular attention, his trained eyes searching for hidden technology. The FBI recording device remains undetected, designed to defeat exactly this kind of inspection. Your Honor, Defense Attorney Cross finally speaks. My client has the right to file constitutional challenges to evidence gathering. While her motion may seem ambitious, the constitutional issues she raises deserve consideration. Judge Ashworth turns his attention to Cross with the expression of someone discovering betrayal from an expected ally. Cross has been appearing in this courtroom for 8 years, accepting plea agreements, avoiding constitutional challenges, keeping proceedings moving with mechanical efficiency. This unexpected support for his client's motion represents dangerous precedent. Mr. Cross, I'm surprised to hear you encouraging frivolous constitutional claims. Perhaps you've forgotten that cooperation makes this system work for everyone. The threat is subtle but unmistakable. Cross's livelihood depends on maintaining good relationships with judges, prosecutors, court staff. Attorneys who challenge the system too aggressively find themselves receiving difficult assignments, hostile treatment, professional ostracism. The message is clear. Support Agent Crestwood's constitutional claims and face career consequences. Cross swallows hard but maintains his position. The Fourth Amendment issues my client raises appear legitimate, Your Honor. I believe they deserve proper consideration. Agent Crestwood watches this exchange with growing respect for her appointed counsel. Cross may be beaten down by the system, but he retains enough professional integrity to recognize genuine constitutional violations when confronted with them. His willingness to support her motion despite obvious professional risks suggests moral courage that the system hasn't completely destroyed. Very well, Judge Ashworth announces with the tone of someone granting an unwanted favor. I'll consider your motion, Ms. Crestwood, but I want you to understand something clearly. Frivolous constitutional claims designed to delay justice will not be tolerated in my courtroom. He reaches for the gavel with dramatic flourish, the brass head catching morning light like a weapon raised in anger. But Agent Crestwood's voice stops him mid-swing. Your Honor, I'd also like to request that these proceedings be recorded by the court reporter for potential appellate review. The request hits the courtroom like electricity through standing water. Court reporter Wren Hartwell looks up from her stenography machine with obvious surprise. Federal appeals courts require complete transcripts for constitutional challenges, but defendants rarely understand enough about appellate procedures to make such requests. The sophistication of Agent Crestwood's legal knowledge becomes more apparent with each exchange. Appellate review? Prosecutor Pike's voice contains genuine alarm. Your Honor, the defendant appears to be planning an appeal before trial has even begun. This suggests bad faith litigation designed to. Every defendant has the right to preserve issues for appeal, Agent Crestwood responds calmly, especially when constitutional violations are alleged. Judge Ashworth slams the gavel down with enough force to crack marble. The sound echoes through the courtroom like thunder, but Agent Crestwood doesn't flinch. She's heard bigger explosions in federal training exercises, faced more dangerous situations in undercover operations, endured more intimidating interrogation techniques in FBI Academy simulations. Ms. Crestwood, Judge Ashworth begins, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You seem to have some very sophisticated ideas about federal constitutional law. Where exactly did you develop this expertise? The question carries layers of meaning that everyone in the courtroom understands. Defendants aren't supposed to know federal constitutional law. They're supposed to rely on overworked public defenders, accept plea agreements gratefully, submit to judicial authority without challenging constitutional violations. Agent Crestwood's legal sophistication threatens the entire system's informal power structure. I've read the relevant cases, Your Honor. Reading cases and understanding constitutional law are different things entirely. Constitutional interpretation requires legal training, professional experience, years of practice in federal courts. Agent Crestwood reaches into her portfolio again, retrieving another document that makes Pike lean forward with obvious concern. It's a federal civil rights complaint form, blank but complete with proper legal citations, federal jurisdiction claims, and constitutional violations that could trigger Department of Justice investigation. Your Honor, I'm prepared to file this federal civil rights action if my constitutional rights continue to be violated in these proceedings. The threat changes everything. Federal civil rights complaints trigger automatic Justice Department review, FBI investigation, potential federal oversight of local court operations. Judges who find themselves subject to federal civil rights investigation often face career destruction, professional disgrace, criminal prosecution. Judge Ashworth's face goes through a spectrum of colors that would fascinate medical professionals. Fury, fear, calculation, and barely controlled rage war across his features as he realizes the weapon this defendant has just aimed at his career. Are you threatening this court, Ms. Crestwood? I'm exercising my constitutional rights, Your Honor. Rights that federal law protects regardless of local judicial preferences. Bailiff Whitlock moves closer to the defendant's table, his hand resting on handcuffs with obvious intention. The atmosphere in this courtroom has shifted from routine legal proceeding to confrontation between federal constitutional authority and local judicial power. Everyone present understands that what happens next will determine whether constitutional rights or judicial intimidation prevails. Your Honor, court reporter Hartwell speaks for the first time. Should I continue recording these exchanges? The question forces Judge Ashworth to make a choice that will define his career's legacy. Federal appeals courts require complete transcripts for constitutional challenges. Stopping the recording would constitute additional constitutional violations, but allowing it to continue means every word of bias, every threat, every violation gets preserved for federal review. Continue recording, he orders through gritted teeth. Agent Crestwood nods slightly, recognizing the significance of this moment. The complete transcript will become evidence in federal prosecution of judicial corruption, constitutional violations, civil rights denial. Every word Judge Ashworth speaks from now forward will be preserved for federal grand jury consideration. If this level of judicial corruption makes your blood boil, you're not alone. This agent's personal story represents thousands of families destroyed by systemic bias. Hit that like button if you believe in accountability, and share this video. People need to know what's really happening in our courts. What would you do if this was your family? Drop your thoughts below. Prosecutor Pike approaches the bench with obvious urgency, requesting a sidebar conference away from recording equipment and gallery observers. Judge Ashworth waves him forward. covering the microphone with his hand in a gesture that suggests recognition of how dangerous this situation has become. The whispered conference lasts 3 minutes, but Agent Crestwood's trained hearing catches fragments that reveal the conversation's content. Pike wants to dismiss charges, retreat from this confrontation before federal attention becomes unavoidable. Judge Ashworth refuses, his pride and power structure threatened by any admission that this defendant's constitutional challenges have merit. Your Honor, Pike announces as they return to their positions, the state maintains that all evidence was legally obtained under proper warrant procedures, and I maintain that those procedures violated clearly established federal constitutional standards. Agent Crestwood responds immediately. The rapid exchange reveals legal sophistication that makes everyone in the courtroom uncomfortable. Defendants aren't supposed to understand warrant procedures, federal constitutional standards, or the complex interplay between state law enforcement and federal constitutional protections. Agent Crestwood's expertise suggests training that goes far beyond casual legal study. Defense Attorney Cross seizes the moment to assert some professional authority. Your Honor, my client raises legitimate constitutional issues that deserve full consideration. I move for an evidentiary hearing on Fourth Amendment violations. Judge Ashworth's glare could melt steel. Cross has just formally endorsed Agent Crestwood's constitutional challenges, creating a record that federal appeals courts will review if this case proceeds to federal jurisdiction. The motion puts Judge Ashworth in an impossible position. Grant the hearing and face detailed examination of constitutional violations, or deny it and create appellate issues that guarantee federal review. Mr. Cross, are you prepared to present evidence that police officers violated federal constitutional standards? If necessary, Your Honor, yes. The answer commits Cross to challenging local law enforcement, prosecutor procedures, and judicial authority. Exactly the kind of constitutional advocacy that typically destroys attorney careers in this jurisdiction. His willingness to take that risk for a client he met hours earlier suggests either remarkable professional courage or recognition that Agent Crestwood's case represents something unprecedented. Agent Crestwood studies the courtroom dynamics with growing satisfaction. Every participant has now created a record of their position on constitutional rights versus judicial authority. Pike has committed to defending questionable evidence. Cross has endorsed constitutional challenges. Judge Ashworth has revealed hostility toward federal oversight. And Hartwell has preserved everything for appellate review. The recording device continues capturing every word, every micro-expression, every moment of bias that federal prosecutors will later present to grand juries considering criminal charges against court officials who violated their oaths of office. Judge Ashworth raises his gavel again, the brass head trembling slightly in his grip. This court will recess for 20 minutes while I consider the legal issues raised by defendants' motions. The 20-minute recess becomes an hour as Judge Ashworth retreats to his chambers for emergency consultation with court administration, prosecutor leadership, and private attorneys who specialize in judicial protection. Through secure phone lines, voices carry the panic of officials realizing their comfortable corruption faces federal investigation. Agent Crestwood remains seated at the defendant's table, reviewing documents that contain more than legal arguments. They hold 3 months of federal surveillance data, financial records tracing private prison payments, and communications intercepts that would end careers if they reach the right federal prosecutors. Her calm demeanor masks the satisfaction of watching a corrupt system begin to consume itself. Court Clerk Meridian Blackwood approaches with coffee and barely concealed nervousness. Ms. Crestwood, perhaps you'd like to reconsider your approach. Judge Ashworth has been very reasonable with defendants who show proper respect for court authority. The offer carries implicit threat wrapped in bureaucratic politeness. Blackwood has witnessed hundreds of defendants who challenged Judge Ashworth's authority, watching their sentences increase dramatically when cooperation gave way to constitutional assertion. Her warning represents one final opportunity to retreat before full judicial retaliation begins. I appreciate the court's concern, Agent Crestwood responds politely, but I believe my constitutional rights deserve protection regardless of local judicial preferences. Blackwood's smile freezes like water in winter wind. The response reveals either remarkable naivety or dangerous confidence that suggests backup resources most defendants lack. Either possibility threatens the comfortable arrangement that has allowed this court system to operate outside constitutional constraints for decades. Defense Attorney Cross uses the recess to conduct hasty legal research, discovering that his client's constitutional arguments rest on solid federal precedent. Supreme Court decisions, federal appellate rulings, and Department of Justice enforcement actions all support the claims she's raised. Her legal sophistication isn't accidental. It's the product of professional training that goes far beyond casual constitutional study. Ms. Crestwood, Cross approaches her with growing respect. Your motions cite federal cases I hadn't considered. Where exactly did you encounter these precedents? Agent Crestwood meets his questioning gaze with steady eyes that reveal nothing about federal law enforcement training, civil rights investigation experience, or the months of preparation that preceded this moment. Constitutional law affects every American citizen, Mr. Cross. I believe everyone should understand their federal rights. The answer deflects inquiry while suggesting depth of knowledge that makes Cross increasingly uncomfortable with assumptions about his client's background. Public defenders typically work with defendants who understand little about legal procedures and nothing about federal constitutional protections. Agent Crestwood represents something entirely different, someone who understands the system well enough to challenge its fundamental operations. Prosecutor Pike spends the recess in frantic consultation with law enforcement leadership, reviewing arrest procedures, warrant applications, and evidence collection methods that suddenly face federal constitutional scrutiny. Phone calls to police supervisors reveal uncomfortable truths about corner cutting, procedural violations, and constitutional shortcuts that seemed acceptable until federal attention became possible. Chief, Pike speaks urgently into his phone. I need you to review every detail of the Crestwood arrest, every procedure, every constitutional requirement, every federal standard. If there's any possibility of Fourth Amendment violations, I need to know immediately. The conversation reveals systematic problems that extend far beyond individual cases. Training deficiencies, procedural shortcuts, constitutional ignorance, all suddenly relevant when facing defendant who understands federal law well enough to challenge local practices effectively. Bailiff Whitlock conducts security sweeps with increased vigilance, searching for recording devices, hidden cameras, anything that might document courtroom proceedings beyond official court reporter transcription. His military training recognizes something familiar in Agent Crestwood's bearing: the controlled alertness of someone accustomed to dangerous situations and hostile environments. But the FBI recording device remains undetected, designed by federal technicians to defeat exactly this kind of inspection. Every word of judicial bias, every constitutional violation, every moment of systematic discrimination gets preserved for federal prosecutors, who will eventually determine whether criminal charges apply to court officials who violated their oaths of office. Court reporter Wren Hartwell reviews her stenography notes with growing unease, recognizing that she's documenting constitutional violations that could trigger federal intervention. 3 decades of court reporting have taught her to recognize which proceedings require careful attention and which can be handled with routine efficiency. This case demands the former, complete accuracy for inevitable federal review. Cases like this remind us how important legal protection really is. With Legal Shield, you get access to experienced attorneys for a fraction of traditional legal costs. Whether you're facing workplace discrimination, need contract review, or require legal consultation, Legal Shield provides peace of mind with 24/7 legal support. Don't wait until you need an attorney to find one. For less than $1 a day, you can have legal protection that could save you thousands. Visit LegalShield.com and use our exclusive link for your first month free. Protect yourself before you need protection. When court reconvenes, Judge Ashworth returns with renewed determination to reassert control over proceedings that have spiraled beyond his comfort zone. His consultation with judicial administration has produced clear instructions: end this constitutional challenge quickly before federal attention becomes unavoidable. Court is back in session, he announces with false confidence. I've reviewed defendants' motions and find them without merit. The suppression motion is denied. Trial will proceed as scheduled. Agent Crestwood stands slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. Your Honor, I respectfully request that you specify the legal grounds for denying my constitutional challenges. The question forces Judge Ashworth to explain his reasoning on the record, creating appellate issues if his analysis proves constitutionally deficient. Federal appeals courts require detailed legal reasoning for decisions that affect constitutional rights, not summary dismissals based on judicial preference. The evidence was legally obtained under valid warrant procedures. Your Honor, the warrant application contained material misrepresentations that invalidate probable cause under federal constitutional standards. Material misrepresentations? Prosecutor Pike's voice carries genuine alarm. Your Honor, the state objects to defendant's characterization of proper police procedures. Agent Crestwood retrieves another document from her portfolio, a motion that makes Pike's face go pale. It's a detailed analysis of the warrant application comparing officer testimony with physical evidence, timestamps with radio logs, narrative descriptions with photographic documentation. Every discrepancy is highlighted, cited, and connected to federal cases requiring warrant suppression when police testimony proves unreliable. Your Honor, Officer Bradley testified that he observed suspicious behavior at 2:15 p.m., but radio logs show he was responding to a traffic accident 3 miles away at 2:10 p.m., with arrival time recorded at 2:25 p.m. Physical impossibility invalidates probable cause under federal constitutional standards. The courtroom goes silent as everyone absorbs the implications of this revelation. Agent Crestwood hasn't just identified police errors, she's documented systematic perjury that undermines the entire prosecution case. More importantly, she's demonstrated access to evidence that defendants typically never see. Radio logs, dispatch records, time-stamped documentation that proves police testimony false. Judge Ashworth's face cycles through confusion, anger, and growing fear as he realizes the sophistication of constitutional challenge facing his court. This isn't casual legal dabbling. It's professional-grade investigation that suggests resources, training, and expertise far beyond typical defendant capabilities. How did you obtain police radio logs, Ms. Crestwood? The question reveals judicial recognition that something unprecedented is occurring. Defendants don't typically access internal police communications, dispatch records, or documentation that law enforcement agencies guard carefully. Agent Crestwood's evidence suggests either remarkable legal resources or connections that threaten established court procedures. Federal law requires disclosure of all evidence relevant to constitutional challenges, Your Honor. Brady v. Maryland, Gilio v. United States, federal due process protections that apply in every American courtroom. The citation of federal precedent with casual expertise makes defense attorney Cross stare at his client with growing amazement. Constitutional scholars spend years mastering these cases, understanding their applications, recognizing their relevance to specific legal situations. Agent Crestwood demonstrates knowledge that suggests formal legal training combined with practical federal court experience. Mr. Innes Pike, Judge Ashworth turns toward the prosecutor with obvious frustration. How do you respond to these allegations of police perjury? Pike shuffles through files with growing desperation, searching for documentation that will support officer testimony against physical evidence that contradicts their statements. Radio logs don't lie. Dispatch records provide accurate timestamps, and photographic evidence reveals truth that narrative descriptions can obscure. Your Honor, the state maintains that Officer Bradley's testimony is accurate. Any apparent discrepancies result from innocent mistakes in record-keeping, not intentional misrepresentation. Innocent mistakes? Agent Crestwood's voice carries quiet authority that makes everyone in the courtroom pay attention. Your Honor, federal courts have consistently held that material false statements in warrant applications require suppression regardless of officer intent. Franks v. Delaware, United States v. Leon, federal constitutional standards that protect all Americans from police perjury. The casual citation of federal precedent with complete accuracy reveals legal expertise that can't be explained by casual constitutional study. Agent Crestwood demonstrates knowledge of federal criminal procedure, constitutional interpretation, and appellate precedent that suggests professional training in federal law enforcement or constitutional litigation. Court reporter Hartwell types faster as legal arguments reach complexity levels that require perfect accuracy for inevitable appellate review. Her stenography machine captures constitutional challenges that will ultimately determine whether local court operations comply with federal standards or violate established civil rights protections. Bailiff Whitlock moves closer to the defendant's table, his hand resting on restraint equipment with obvious intention. The atmosphere has shifted from legal proceeding to confrontation between federal constitutional authority and local judicial power structures that depend on constitutional ignorance for their continued operation. Your Honor, Agent Crestwood continues with calm determination, I also move to dismiss charges under the federal exclusionary rule. Evidence obtained through police perjury cannot support prosecution under any circumstances. The motion for dismissal represents nuclear escalation in constitutional warfare that has already exceeded everyone's comfort levels. Federal exclusionary rules require dismissal of charges based on illegally obtained evidence, regardless of prosecutor preference or judicial convenience. Agent Crestwood is demanding that federal constitutional law trump local judicial authority. Judge Ashworth raises his gavel with trembling hands, the brass head reflecting courtroom lights like a weapon prepared for desperate battle. Ms. Crestwood, your constitutional theatrics will not intimidate this court into abandoning proper legal procedures. I'm not trying to intimidate anyone, Your Honor. I'm exercising constitutional rights that federal law protects regardless of local judicial hostility. The exchange crystallizes the fundamental conflict between constitutional rights and judicial authority that has defined this proceeding from its opening moments. Agent Crestwood represents federal constitutional supremacy while Judge Ashworth defends local judicial autonomy from federal oversight that threatens comfortable corruption. Bailiff Whitlock, Judge Ashworth orders with forced authority, if defendant continues disrupting these proceedings, she will be held in criminal contempt. The threat of contempt charges represents Judge's final weapon against constitutional challenges that exceed his ability to suppress through normal intimidation. Criminal contempt allows immediate incarceration without trial, jury consideration, or appellate protection, exactly the kind of judicial retaliation that federal civil rights law was designed to prevent. Agent Crestwood meets this threat with steady eyes that have faced federal criminals, domestic terrorists, and corruption at levels Judge Ashworth couldn't imagine. Your Honor, I understand contempt procedures under Federal Rule 42. Criminal contempt requires proof of willful disruption with intent to obstruct judicial proceedings. Exercising constitutional rights doesn't meet that standard under federal law. Hold on, because what she reveals next will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about this case. The evidence she's about to present goes deeper than anyone imagined. Smash that like button because this revelation changes everything. Are you ready to see how far this corruption really goes? The next few minutes will blow your mind. The citation of Federal Rule 42 with complete accuracy makes everyone in the courtroom realize they're witnessing something unprecedented. Defendants don't typically understand federal contempt procedures, constitutional protections against judicial retaliation, or the complex interplay between state court authority and federal constitutional rights. Agent Crestwood's expertise suggests training that goes far beyond casual legal study. Judge Ashworth slams his gavel down with enough force to crack marble, but Agent Crestwood doesn't flinch. She's experienced federal training exercises that involved simulated explosions, combat scenarios, and life-threatening situations that make judicial intimidation seem like amateur theater. Ms. Crestwood, Judge Ashworth begins with dangerous calm. You seem remarkably well informed about federal constitutional law for someone charged with drug possession. Perhaps you'd like to explain where you developed this expertise. The question carries layers of meaning that everyone present understands. Judicial curiosity about defendant background typically signals preparation for enhanced retaliation. Judges who feel threatened by constitutional challenges often respond with investigations designed to uncover information that can be used for character assassination or sentence enhancement. Agent Crestwood maintains perfect composure despite understanding the threat implicit in judicial curiosity. Her federal training included preparation for exactly this scenario, maintaining cover while facing hostile interrogation from targets of federal investigation. Constitutional law affects every American citizen, Your Honor. Everyone should understand their federal rights. Understanding constitutional theory and applying federal precedent are entirely different matters. Constitutional application requires legal training, federal court experience, professional expertise that takes years to develop. Defense Attorney Cross recognizes the danger in Judge Ashworth's line of questioning and attempts to redirect attention toward purely legal issues. Your Honor, regardless of how my client acquired her knowledge, her constitutional arguments rest on established federal precedent that deserves consideration. Mr. Cross, I'm beginning to question whether your client is receiving assistance from sources that haven't been disclosed to this court. The implication threatens to expand judicial retaliation beyond Agent Crestwood to include her attorney, court observers, and anyone who might be providing constitutional guidance. Judge Ashworth is suggesting conspiracy to obstruct justice through constitutional assertion, exactly the kind of paranoid reaction that federal investigators expect from corrupt officials facing exposure. Your Honor, Agent Crestwood responds calmly, I'm representing myself with assistance from appointed counsel. No undisclosed parties are involved in my constitutional challenges. The statement is technically accurate while concealing the federal law enforcement training, constitutional education, and investigative resources that actually support her legal arguments. Undercover federal agents are trained to maintain cover through careful truth-telling that reveals nothing about their actual identity or mission. Prosecutor Pike approaches the bench again, requesting another sidebar conference that suggests growing panic among court officials who recognize that routine intimidation tactics aren't working against this defendant. Whispered conversations reveal fears about federal attention, constitutional challenges, and potential career consequences if this case proceeds to appellate review. Your Honor, Pike announces after returning to his position, The state requests a competency evaluation to determine defendant's mental fitness for trial proceedings. The motion represents desperate escalation designed to delay constitutional challenges while suggesting that anyone who understands federal law well enough to challenge local authority must be mentally deficient. Competency evaluations can take months, during which defendants typically remain incarcerated, and often result in forced medication that affects cognitive function. Agent Crestwood's training included preparation for exactly this attack on constitutional assertion. Federal agents working undercover in hostile environments learn to recognize attempts at psychological manipulation, medical retaliation, and psychiatric intimidation designed to undermine their effectiveness. Your Honor, I object to prosecutor's motion. Competency evaluations require specific evidence of mental deficiency, not simply constitutional knowledge that makes court officials uncomfortable. The response demonstrates understanding of competency law that makes Pike's suggestion appear even more desperate. Federal courts have consistently held that legal sophistication, constitutional knowledge, or courtroom confidence cannot be used as evidence of mental deficiency requiring evaluation. Court reporter Hartwell continues documenting exchanges that reveal systematic attempt to punish constitutional assertion through psychiatric retaliation. Her complete transcript will eventually help federal investigators understand how local court systems attempt to suppress constitutional rights through medical intimidation. Judge Ashworth studies Agent Crestwood with growing recognition that standard judicial weapons have proven ineffective against this defendant. Intimidation hasn't worked, constitutional ignorance doesn't exist, plea negotiations have failed, and competency challenges lack foundation. Traditional tools of judicial authority face unprecedented resistance. The court denies prosecutor's motion for competency evaluation. He announces reluctantly, "However, I warn defendant that frivolous constitutional claims will not be tolerated indefinitely." Agent Crestwood nods politely while recognizing that Judge Ashworth has exhausted legal options for suppressing her constitutional challenges. Federal appellate courts will review complete transcripts that document judicial hostility toward constitutional rights, prosecutor attempts at psychiatric retaliation, and systematic bias against defendants who understand federal law. The recording device continues capturing every word, every threat, every violation of federal civil rights law that will eventually support criminal prosecution of court officials who violated their oaths to protect constitutional rights. 3 months of federal investigation are reaching culmination as corrupt officials reveal themselves through their own actions. Bailiff Whitlock receives whispered instructions that make his hand move toward restraint equipment with renewed purpose. The atmosphere suggests preparation for physical confrontation if constitutional challenges continue beyond judicial tolerance levels. Agent Crestwood's federal training helps her recognize signs of impending violence that civilian defendants might miss. Your Honor, she continues with calm authority, I also move for federal civil rights protection under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. This court's hostility toward constitutional assertion violates clearly established federal law. The citation of federal civil rights statutes with perfect accuracy makes everyone realize that Agent Crestwood possesses legal knowledge that extends far beyond criminal procedure into civil rights enforcement, federal jurisdiction, and constitutional protection mechanisms that most attorneys never encounter. Federal civil rights actions under Section 1983 allow private lawsuits against government officials who violate constitutional rights under color of law. These actions can result in federal court supervision, monetary damages, injunctive relief, and criminal prosecution of officials who systematically deny constitutional protections. Judge Ashworth's face goes through color changes that would fascinate medical professionals as he realizes the weapon Agent Crestwood has just aimed at his career. Federal civil rights litigation triggers automatic Justice Department investigation, FBI oversight, and potential federal prosecution that could end his judicial career in disgrace. Are you threatening this court with federal litigation, Ms. Crestwood? I'm exercising rights that federal law protects, Your Honor. Rights that exist regardless of local judicial preference or comfort level. The exchange represents final confrontation between federal constitutional authority and local judicial power that has operated outside constitutional constraints for decades. Everyone in the courtroom understands that what happens next will determine whether constitutional rights or judicial intimidation ultimately prevails. Court Clerk Blackwood types urgently on her computer, sending messages to administrative officials who need immediate notification that federal constitutional challenges have reached critical mass. Local court operations face potential federal oversight that could expose decades of systematic constitutional violations. Defense attorney Cross seizes this moment to assert constitutional authority that he's rarely been able to exercise in Judge Ashworth's courtroom. Your Honor, my client's federal civil rights claims appear to have substantial merit. This court's treatment of constitutional challenges suggests a pattern of hostility that federal law prohibits. The statement commits Cross to supporting Agent Crestwood's constitutional assertions despite obvious career risks. Attorneys who challenge judicial authority in this jurisdiction typically face professional retaliation, but Cross appears willing to risk career consequences for constitutional principles that the system has abandoned. Agent Crestwood watches these proceedings with growing satisfaction as every participant creates evidence of their position on constitutional rights versus judicial authority. Federal prosecutors will later review complete transcripts that document systematic resistance to constitutional law by officials sworn to uphold it. Understanding your legal rights shouldn't require a law degree. With Masterclass, you can learn from legal experts, former FBI agents, and criminal justice professionals who break down complex legal concepts into understandable lessons. Whether you're interested in criminal justice, constitutional law, or investigative techniques, Masterclass offers world-class instruction from industry leaders. Right now, new subscribers get unlimited access to all classes for just $10 per month. Use our link below and start learning from the best minds in law enforcement and legal practice today. The recording device continues its silent work, preserving everything for federal review that will determine whether criminal charges apply to court officials who have systematically violated constitutional rights under color of law. 3 months of federal investigation have produced evidence of corruption, bias, and constitutional violation that will support federal prosecution. Judge Ashworth raises his gavel one final time, the brass head trembling in his grip as he prepares to cross lines that will define his career's legacy. Ms. Crestwood, if you continue these disruptions, I will hold you in criminal contempt regardless of your constitutional theories. Agent Crestwood meets this ultimate threat with steady eyes that reflect federal training, constitutional education, and investigative experience that Judge Ashworth couldn't imagine. Your Honor, I understand that constitutional challenges make court officials uncomfortable. But discomfort doesn't justify violating clearly established federal law. The words hang in courtroom air like the calm before a constitutional storm that will reshape local judicial operations forever. Federal law enforcement agents have successfully documented systematic constitutional violations, judicial bias, and criminal behavior that violates official oaths of office. What happens next will determine whether constitutional rights or corrupt authority ultimately prevails in American courtrooms designed to protect justice under law. The constitutional standoff reaches critical mass as Judge Ashworth realizes his traditional weapons of judicial intimidation have proven utterly ineffective against this defendant. 3 decades of unchallenged authority face unprecedented resistance from someone who understands federal law well enough to challenge every aspect of local court operations. The recording device continues its silent documentation, preserving evidence that will eventually reshape this entire judicial district. Federal protocols trigger automatically when constitutional challenges reach the sophistication level Agent Crestwood has demonstrated. Somewhere in Washington, D.C., Justice Department computers flag this case for potential civil rights investigation based on algorithmic analysis of legal citations, constitutional arguments, and federal precedent that defendant has referenced with professional accuracy. Court reporter Wren Hartwell types with increasing urgency, recognizing that she's documenting proceedings that will require federal review. Her stenography machine captures constitutional violations that transform routine criminal case into potential federal civil rights prosecution. Every word matters now. Every exchange carries weight that extends far beyond local judicial authority. Your Honor, Agent Crestwood continues with calm determination that unnerves everyone present, I formally request federal oversight of these proceedings under the Civil Rights Act. This court's systematic hostility toward constitutional assertion violates clearly established federal law. The request triggers mandatory notification protocols that Judge Ashworth cannot ignore without creating additional constitutional violations. Federal civil rights law requires judicial cooperation with oversight mechanisms designed to protect constitutional rights from local judicial bias. Resistance to federal oversight constitutes separate criminal offense under federal law. Prosecutor Pike approaches the bench with obvious panic, whispering urgently about federal attention, career consequences, and potential criminal prosecution that could result from continued constitutional violations. His comfortable arrangement with Judge Ashworth faces destruction if federal investigators begin examining their coordination in suppressing defendant rights. Defense Attorney Cross seizes this moment to assert constitutional authority he's rarely been able to exercise in this courtroom. Your Honor, federal law requires immediate compliance with civil rights oversight. Continued resistance constitutes additional constitutional violations that federal prosecutors will review. The statement commits Cross to supporting federal intervention despite obvious career risks in this jurisdiction. Attorneys who invite federal oversight typically face professional retaliation from judicial and prosecutorial authorities who prefer operating without constitutional constraints. His willingness to risk career consequences suggests recognition that constitutional principles outweigh personal comfort. Bailiff Whitlock receives whispered instructions that make his hand move toward communication equipment with obvious purpose. Federal notification requirements demand immediate contact with Justice Department Civil Rights Division, FBI oversight mechanisms, and federal monitoring systems designed to document constitutional violations in local courts. Judge Ashworth studies the federal civil rights request with growing recognition that he faces an impossible choice. Grant federal oversight and submit to constitutional monitoring that will expose decades of systematic violations, or deny it and create appellate issues that guarantee federal intervention anyway. Either path leads to federal scrutiny that threatens his career. Ms. Munez Crestwood, he begins carefully, federal oversight involves complex procedural requirements that may not apply to routine criminal proceedings. Your Honor, federal civil rights law applies to every American courtroom. Constitutional protections don't become optional based on local judicial preference. The exchange crystallizes fundamental conflict between federal constitutional supremacy and local judicial autonomy that has defined American legal systems since its founding. Agent Crestwood represents federal authority while Judge Ashworth defends local control from constitutional constraints that threaten comfortable corruption. Court Clerk Meridian Blackwood types urgent messages to administrative officials who need immediate notification that federal constitutional challenges have reached critical mass. Her computer screen displays emergency protocols for federal oversight requests, procedural requirements that local courts rarely encounter but cannot legally ignore. Your Honor, Agent Crestwood continues with professional authority that makes everyone uncomfortable. I also request immediate preservation of all evidence related to systematic constitutional violations in this court. Federal law requires complete documentation for civil rights investigation. The preservation request triggers additional mandatory procedures that Judge Ashworth cannot refuse without creating obstruction charges under federal law. Evidence preservation includes financial records, communication logs, case files, and judicial correspondence that could expose corruption network extending far beyond this single courtroom. Federal investigation protocols begin automatically when constitutional challenges reach this level of sophistication. Computer systems in Washington, D.C. flag case references, legal citations, and procedural arguments that suggest professional-grade constitutional knowledge requiring federal attention. Agent Crestwood's expertise has triggered oversight mechanisms designed to protect constitutional rights from local judicial hostility. Prosecutor Pike's phone buzzes with messages from law enforcement supervisors who suddenly need detailed explanations for arrest procedures, warrant applications, and evidence collection methods that face federal constitutional scrutiny. Radio logs, dispatch records, and officer communications that seemed routine now require careful review for potential constitutional violations. Chief, Pike speaks urgently into his phone during brief recess. We need immediate review of all Crestwood case documentation. Every procedure, every constitutional requirement, every federal standard. If federal investigators start examining our methods, the conversation reveals systematic problems extending far beyond individual cases. Training deficiencies, procedural shortcuts, constitutional ignorance, all suddenly relevant when facing federal oversight that could expose decades of systematic civil rights violations throughout local law enforcement. Defense Attorney Cross uses the interruption to conduct rapid research on federal civil rights procedures, discovering that his client's requests rest on solid legal foundation. Federal oversight mechanisms exist specifically to address judicial bias, constitutional violations, and systematic denial of civil rights that local authorities refuse to correct through normal channels. Ms. Crestwood, Cross approaches her with growing respect. Your federal civil rights claims trigger mandatory Justice Department review. This court cannot legally refuse federal oversight once constitutional violations reach this level. Agent Crestwood nods with satisfaction that her months of preparation have achieved intended results. Federal investigation protocols are engaging exactly as designed, creating momentum toward federal intervention that Judge Ashworth cannot stop through local judicial authority. Court reporter Hartwell continues documenting exchanges that will form foundation for federal civil rights prosecution. Her stenography machine captures judicial resistance to constitutional law, prosecutor panic about federal attention, and systematic bias that violates official oaths to protect constitutional rights under law. When proceedings resume, Judge Ashworth returns with forced composure that masks growing panic about federal attention threatening his career. Consultation with judicial administration has produced clear instructions. End constitutional challenges immediately before federal oversight becomes unavoidable, regardless of legal legitimacy. Court is back in session. I've consulted with appropriate authorities regarding defendant's federal oversight request. Agent Crestwood sits perfectly straight, hands folded, waiting for judicial response that will determine whether constitutional rights or corrupt authority ultimately prevails. Her federal training prepared her for exactly this moment, the critical decision point where corrupt officials either submit to constitutional law or reveal criminal intent through continued resistance. Your Honor, federal civil rights law doesn't require local administrative approval. Constitutional protections exist independently of local judicial comfort levels. The statement demonstrates understanding of federal constitutional supremacy that makes Judge Ashworth realize he faces defendant with legal knowledge extending far beyond criminal procedure into federal jurisdiction, civil rights enforcement, and constitutional authority that trumps local judicial power. Ms. Crestwood, your constitutional theories will not prevent this court from fulfilling its legal obligations. I agree completely, Your Honor. Federal constitutional law creates legal obligations that every American court must fulfill regardless of local preference. The verbal jujitsu turns Judge Ashworth's statement against him, using his own words to support federal constitutional authority over local judicial resistance. Agent Crestwood's expertise in constitutional interpretation allows her to transform judicial hostility into evidence of constitutional violation. Cases like this remind us how important legal protection really is. With Legal Shield, you get access to experienced attorneys for a fraction of traditional legal costs. Whether you're facing workplace discrimination, need contract review, or require legal consultation, Legal Shield provides peace of mind with 24/7 legal support. Don't wait until you need an attorney to find one. For less than $1 a day, you can have legal protection that could save you thousands. Visit LegalShield.com and use our exclusive link for your first month free. Protect yourself before you need protection. Federal oversight mechanisms continue engaging through electronic systems that monitor constitutional challenges, legal citations, and procedural arguments for patterns suggesting systematic civil rights violations. Agent Crestwood's professional-grade constitutional knowledge has triggered automatic Justice Department attention that operates independently of local judicial preference. Your Honor, she continues with calm authority, I also request immediate federal investigation of financial relationships between this court and private prison corporations. Federal law prohibits judicial decisions influenced by financial incentives that violate constitutional rights. The request hits courtroom like federal subpoena, revealing Agent Crestwood's knowledge of corruption network that extends from judicial chambers to corporate boardrooms. Financial relationships between courts and private prisons constitute federal criminal violations when they influence sentencing decisions or constitutional protections. Judge Ashworth's face cycles through confusion, anger, and growing terror as he realizes this defendant possesses detailed knowledge of corruption that should remain hidden from federal attention. Private prison relationships require careful concealment to avoid federal prosecution under RICO statutes that treat systematic corruption as organized crime. Prosecutor Pike drops his phone with audible crash, staring at defendant who somehow knows about financial arrangements that only insider knowledge could reveal. Private prison payments to judicial campaigns, speaking fees for prosecutor conferences, consulting contracts for court staff, all carefully hidden from public scrutiny that federal investigation would expose. How could you possibly know about? Pike begins before recognizing the danger in acknowledging financial relationships that federal law treats as criminal conspiracy when they influence constitutional rights. Agent Crestwood meets his questioning gaze with steady eyes that reveal nothing about federal surveillance, financial investigation, or months of intelligence gathering that preceded this moment. Federal financial disclosure requirements apply to all government officials, Mr. Pike. Public information for anyone willing to research judicial ethics. The explanation deflects inquiry while suggesting depth of investigation that makes court officials increasingly uncomfortable with assumptions about her background. Federal financial records exist for anyone with proper access credentials, research capabilities, and understanding of where to locate judicial ethics violations. Court Clerk Blackwood's computer screen displays emergency financial protocols as federal oversight systems begin examining this court's relationships with private corporations. Electronic alerts notify Justice Department Financial Crimes Division that constitutional challenges have revealed potential corruption requiring immediate federal investigation. Bailiff Whitlock receives additional whispered instructions that make him move toward secure communication equipment with renewed urgency. Federal notification requirements demand immediate contact with oversight agencies that monitor judicial corruption, constitutional violations, and civil rights abuses in local court systems. Defense Attorney Cross recognizes opportunity to assert constitutional principles that this court system has systematically suppressed for decades. Your Honor, federal law requires complete financial transparency for judicial officials. Any private relationships that influence constitutional rights constitute federal criminal violations. The statement creates formal record of constitutional challenge that federal appeals courts will review if this case proceeds to federal jurisdiction. Cross has committed to supporting federal investigation despite obvious career risks in jurisdiction that retaliates against attorneys who invite constitutional oversight. Agent Crestwood studies courtroom dynamics with growing satisfaction as federal oversight mechanisms engage automatically in response to constitutional challenges that have exceeded local judicial capability to suppress through normal intimidation. Every participant has now created evidence of their position on constitutional rights versus corrupt authority. Your Honor, she continues with professional calm that unnerves everyone present, I move for immediate recusal under 28 U.S.C. Section 455. Financial relationships with private prison corporations create conflict of interest that requires judicial disqualification. The recusal motion represents nuclear escalation in constitutional warfare that has already exceeded everyone's comfort levels. Federal recusal statutes require judicial disqualification when financial interests create appearance of bias, regardless of judicial preference or case convenience. Agent Crestwood is demanding that federal ethics law trump local judicial authority. Judge Ashworth's hands tremble as he grips the gavel, recognizing that recusal motion creates impossible choice between acknowledging financial conflicts or denying obvious constitutional requirements. Either response generates appellate issues that guarantee federal review of his judicial conduct, financial relationships, and constitutional violations. Court reporter Hartwell types faster as constitutional challenges reach complexity levels that require perfect accuracy for inevitable federal review. Her stenography machine captures recusal motion that will force federal examination of judicial ethics, financial corruption, and systematic constitutional violations throughout this court system. Ms. Crestwood, Judge Ashworth begins with dangerous calm. Your recusal motion appears designed to delay proceedings rather than address legitimate constitutional issues. Your Honor, federal recusal statutes exist to protect constitutional rights from judicial bias. Financial relationships with private prisons create exactly the kind of conflict that federal law was designed to prevent. The exchange demonstrates Agent Crestwood's mastery of federal judicial ethics law that extends far beyond criminal procedure into constitutional protection mechanisms that most attorneys never encounter. Her expertise suggests formal training in federal law enforcement, judicial oversight, or constitutional litigation. Federal computer systems continue monitoring this case through electronic networks that track constitutional challenges, legal citations, and procedural arguments requiring Justice Department attention. Agent Crestwood's professional knowledge has triggered automatic oversight that operates independently of local judicial preference or comfort level. Prosecutor Pike approaches bench again with obvious desperation, requesting private conference away from recording equipment and federal monitoring systems that now track every word spoken in constitutional challenge proceedings. Whispered conversations reveal panic about federal attention, career consequences, and criminal prosecution that could result from continued constitutional resistance. Your Honor, Pike announces after returning to his position, the state requests immediate dismissal of all charges to avoid further delay in court operations. The dismissal request represents complete prosecutorial surrender in face of constitutional challenges that threaten to expose systematic corruption extending far beyond this individual case. Pike recognizes that federal attention could destroy careers, trigger criminal prosecutions, and reshape entire local justice system. But Agent Crestwood cannot allow easy escape that would prevent federal documentation of systematic constitutional violations requiring Justice Department intervention. Your Honor, dismissal doesn't address underlying constitutional violations that federal law requires this court to remedy. Civil rights investigation must proceed regardless of case disposition. The response traps court officials in constitutional accountability that they cannot escape through dismissal, plea agreements, or procedural manipulation. Federal civil rights law creates obligations that exist independently of individual case outcomes, requiring systemic reform when constitutional violations reach pattern or practice levels. Judge Ashworth realizes that traditional judicial weapons have proven completely ineffective against defendant who understands federal law well enough to challenge every aspect of local court operations. Intimidation has failed. Constitutional ignorance doesn't exist. Procedural manipulation creates appellate issues, and federal oversight cannot be avoided through local judicial authority. The court denies prosecutors' motion for dismissal. These proceedings will continue under proper legal standards. Agent Crestwood nods with satisfaction, recognizing that Judge Ashworth has committed to continuing constitutional violations that federal prosecutors will later present to grand juries, considering criminal charges against court officials who systematically deny constitutional rights under color of law. The recording device continues its silent work, preserving everything for federal review that will determine whether criminal prosecution applies to judicial officials who have violated their oaths to protect constitutional rights. 3 months of federal investigation approach culmination as corrupt officials reveal themselves through their own actions and words. Constitutional warfare reaches crescendo as federal oversight mechanisms engage with full force, transforming routine criminal proceeding into confrontation between local corruption and federal constitutional authority. Agent Crestwood's months of preparation achieve intended results as every court official faces choice between submitting to constitutional law or revealing criminal intent through continued resistance. Electronic surveillance systems in Washington, D.C. monitor this case through networks designed to identify systematic constitutional violations requiring Justice Department intervention. Computer algorithms analyze legal citations, procedural arguments, and constitutional challenges for patterns suggesting professional-grade federal law enforcement knowledge that triggers automatic investigation protocols. Judge Ashworth realizes that standard judicial intimidation tactics have proven completely ineffective against defendant whose constitutional expertise suggests training, resources, and backup support that typical defendants never possess. His comfortable corruption faces federal scrutiny that could end his career in criminal prosecution and professional disgrace. Crestwood, he begins with forced composure that masks growing panic. Your constitutional challenges appear designed to delay justice rather than seek legitimate legal remedies. Your Honor, constitutional rights don't become optional based on local judicial convenience. Federal law requires protection of constitutional rights regardless of court scheduling preferences. The response demonstrates Agent Crestwood's mastery of constitutional supremacy doctrine that makes Judge Ashworth realize he faces someone with legal knowledge extending far beyond criminal procedure into federal jurisdiction, civil rights enforcement, and constitutional authority that trumps local judicial power. Court Clerk Blackwood receives urgent electronic messages from administrative officials who need immediate briefing on federal oversight requests that have never before been filed in this jurisdiction. Emergency protocols for constitutional challenges reveal procedural requirements that local courts rarely encounter but cannot legally ignore without creating additional federal violations. Federal investigation protocols continue engaging through Justice Department networks that monitor constitutional challenges for patterns suggesting systematic civil rights violations. Agent Crestwood's expertise has triggered oversight mechanisms that operate independently of local judicial authority, creating momentum toward federal intervention that cannot be stopped through local resistance. Prosecutor Pike conducts frantic consultation with law enforcement supervisors who suddenly need detailed explanations for evidence collection methods, arrest procedures, and constitutional protections that face federal scrutiny. Radio logs, dispatch records, and officer communications that seemed routine now require careful review for potential civil rights violations. Defense Attorney Cross uses the mounting tension to assert constitutional principles he's rarely been able to exercise in this courtroom. Your Honor, federal constitutional law creates binding legal obligations that this court cannot ignore regardless of local preference. My client's challenges rest on established Supreme Court precedent. The statement commits Cross to supporting federal intervention despite obvious career risks in jurisdiction that retaliates against attorneys who invite constitutional oversight. His willingness to risk professional consequences suggests recognition that constitutional principles outweigh personal comfort and career security. Bailiff Whitlock monitors courtroom security with increasing vigilance, recognizing signs of institutional stress that could escalate into confrontation if constitutional challenges continue beyond judicial tolerance levels. His military training helps him identify potential flashpoints where legal proceedings could deteriorate into physical altercation. Agent Crestwood observes these dynamics with professional calm that masks satisfaction at watching corrupt system begin consuming itself through constitutional accountability. Federal training prepared her for exactly this scenario, the moment when corrupt officials realize their comfortable arrangement faces federal destruction. Your Honor, she continues with quiet authority that makes everyone pay attention, I also request immediate federal investigation of sentencing disparities in this court. Statistical analysis reveals pattern of racial bias that violates equal protection guarantees under federal constitutional law. The statistical analysis request hits courtroom like federal indictment, revealing Agent Crestwood's knowledge of data analysis techniques that could expose systematic discrimination affecting hundreds of cases over decades of judicial bias. Federal statistical analysis provides mathematical proof of constitutional violations that individual case challenges cannot demonstrate. Judge Ashworth's face goes through color spectrum that would fascinate medical professionals as he realizes the scope of federal investigation that statistical analysis could trigger. Sentencing data reveals patterns that mathematical analysis can prove constitute systematic constitutional violations requiring federal intervention under civil rights law. Prosecutor Pike stares at defendant who somehow understands federal statistical analysis techniques that only professional investigators typically employ for civil rights enforcement. Data analysis requires resources, training, and expertise suggesting connections to federal law enforcement or civil rights organizations with capacity for systematic investigation. Statistical analysis requires access to comprehensive sentencing data. Pike objects with obvious concern. Defendant lacks authority to examine confidential court records for mathematical analysis purposes. Federal Freedom of Information Act provides public access to sentencing statistics, Mr. Pike. Mathematical analysis of public records reveals patterns that federal civil rights law treats as evidence of systematic constitutional violations. Agent Crestwood's casual citation of federal information access law with complete accuracy makes everyone realize her knowledge extends beyond constitutional criminal procedure into administrative law, civil rights enforcement, and federal transparency requirements that most attorneys never encounter in practice. Court reporter Hartwell types urgently as constitutional challenges reach sophistication levels that require perfect documentation for inevitable federal appellate review. Statistical analysis of sentencing patterns could provide mathematical proof of systematic bias that federal courts treat as prima facie evidence of constitutional violations. Federal electronic monitoring systems continue tracking this case through networks designed to identify civil rights violations requiring Justice Department attention. Computer algorithms analyzing legal citations and constitutional arguments have flagged this proceeding for potential federal investigation based on professional-grade legal knowledge that suggests federal law enforcement involvement. Hold on, because what she reveals next will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about this case. The evidence she's about to present goes deeper than anyone imagined. Smash that like button because this revelation changes everything. Are you ready to see how far this corruption really goes? The next few minutes will blow your mind. The constitutional confrontation reaches critical mass as Judge Ashworth realizes his authority faces unprecedented challenge from defendant whose expertise suggests training and resources that threaten to expose systematic corruption extending throughout local judicial system. Traditional weapons of judicial intimidation have proven utterly ineffective against constitutional knowledge that appears professional grade. Ms. Crestwood, Judge Ashworth attempts one final assertion of authority. I will not allow constitutional theatrics to transform my courtroom into federal playground for activist legal theories. Your Honor, federal constitutional law isn't theoretical. It's binding legal requirement that every American court must follow regardless of local judicial philosophy. The exchange crystallizes fundamental conflict between federal constitutional supremacy and local judicial resistance that has defined this entire proceeding. Agent Crestwood represents federal authority, while Judge Ashworth defends local autonomy from constitutional constraints that threaten comfortable corruption. Court Clerk Blackwood's computer displays emergency federal oversight protocols as Justice Department monitoring systems begin active investigation of constitutional violations reported through electronic surveillance networks. Automatic federal attention creates momentum that local authorities cannot stop through normal intimidation or procedural manipulation. Bailiff Whitlock receives final whispered instructions that make his hand move toward restraint equipment with obvious intention. Judicial authority faces complete breakdown if constitutional challenges continue beyond local capacity to suppress through traditional intimidation methods. Physical confrontation becomes possible when legal authority proves insufficient. Agent Crestwood recognizes signs of potential violence that her federal training taught her to identify in hostile environments. Corrupt officials facing exposure often resort to physical intimidation when legal weapons prove ineffective. Her positioning allows rapid response if courtroom tension escalates beyond verbal confrontation. Your Honor, she continues with calm authority despite growing physical threat, I move for immediate federal investigation under 42 U.S.C. Section 1441. This court's systematic hostility toward constitutional rights creates pattern or practice violation requiring federal intervention. The citation of federal pattern or practice statutes represents ultimate constitutional weapon that could trigger complete federal takeover of local court operations. Section 1441 allows Justice Department supervision, federal monitoring, and court-imposed reform when constitutional violations reach systematic levels. Judge Ashworth's hands tremble as constitutional authority he cannot challenge or suppress faces him with federal law that trumps local judicial power absolutely. Pattern or practice investigation could expose decades of systematic corruption, bias, and constitutional violation that federal prosecutors treat as criminal conspiracy under RICO statutes. Are you threatening federal intervention in local court operations, Ms. Crestwood? I'm exercising constitutional rights that federal law protects, Your Honor. Rights that exist regardless of local judicial comfort or career concerns. The response transforms Judge Ashworth's question into acknowledgement of federal constitutional supremacy over local judicial authority. Agent Crestwood's expertise allows her to use judicial hostility as evidence of constitutional violation while maintaining perfect legal positioning for federal protection. Prosecutor Pike approaches bench with final desperate attempt to prevent federal attention that could destroy careers throughout local justice system. Whispered conference reveals panic about criminal prosecution, career destruction, and federal investigation that could expose corruption network extending from courtroom to corporate boardrooms. Your Honor, Pike announces after returning to position with visible defeat, the state moves for indefinite postponement pending constitutional review. The postponement motion represents complete prosecutorial surrender in face of constitutional challenges that threaten to expose systematic corruption requiring federal criminal investigation. Pike recognizes that continued proceedings could create evidence supporting federal prosecution of court officials who systematically deny constitutional rights. But Agent Crestwood cannot allow escape through postponement that would prevent federal documentation of constitutional violations requiring immediate Justice Department intervention. Your Honor, constitutional violations don't disappear through procedural delay. Federal civil rights law requires immediate remedy regardless of local judicial scheduling preferences. The response traps court officials in constitutional accountability that continues regardless of case postponement, dismissal, or procedural manipulation. Federal oversight operates independently of local case management, requiring systematic reform when constitutional violations reach documented levels of systematic bias. Judge Ashworth realizes he faces impossible choice between acknowledging constitutional violations or creating additional federal evidence through continued resistance. Either path leads to federal scrutiny that threatens career, reputation, and potential criminal prosecution for systematic denial of constitutional rights under color of law. The gavel trembles in his grip as 30 years of unchallenged authority meet federal constitutional law that cannot be intimidated, suppressed, or manipulated through local judicial power. Constitutional supremacy proves absolute when confronted by defendant who understands federal law well enough to challenge every aspect of local court operations. Bailiff Whitlock, Judge Ashworth orders with voice that cracks under pressure, place defendant under arrest for criminal contempt of court. The contempt order represents final desperate attempt to suppress constitutional challenges through immediate incarceration without trial, jury consideration, or appellate protection. Criminal contempt allows judges to imprison defendants immediately for behavior that threatens judicial authority, regardless of constitutional legitimacy. Agent Crestwood stands slowly as Whitlock approaches with handcuffs. Her movements controlled and deliberate despite understanding that contempt arrest could compromise federal investigation requiring her continued freedom to document constitutional violations. This moment represents ultimate test of federal constitutional protection versus local judicial retaliation. But before Whitlock can complete arrest procedures, Agent Crestwood reaches into her jacket with movements that make everyone freeze in sudden recognition that something unprecedented is about to occur. Her hand emerges not with weapon or resistance, but with leather credential case that catches courtroom lights like revelation of hidden truth. The FBI badge and federal identification reflect overhead fluorescence with authority that transforms courtroom atmosphere instantly. Special Agent Indigo Crestwood, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Civil Rights Division, Criminal Investigation Section. 3 months of undercover investigation crystallize in this moment of federal revelation that reshapes power dynamics completely. Your Honor, she announces with voice that carries federal authority backed by constitutional supremacy, you are under federal investigation for systematic civil rights violations under color of law. This courtroom has been under federal surveillance for constitutional violation that violate 18 U.S.C. Section 242. The badge revelation hits courtroom like federal earthquake, transforming assumptions about power, authority, and legal positioning that everyone had accepted throughout these proceedings. Agent Crestwood represents federal law enforcement conducting undercover investigation of systematic constitutional violations that could result in criminal prosecution of court officials. Judge Ashworth stares at federal credentials with expression of someone watching career destruction unfold in real time. Every racist comment, every constitutional violation, every moment of systematic bias has been documented by federal agent whose investigation could support criminal charges under civil rights law. Court Clerk Blackwood's fingers freeze over keyboard as she realizes her participation in constitutional violations has been recorded by federal law enforcement for potential criminal prosecution. Financial corruption, procedural bias, and systematic discrimination all captured for federal grand jury consideration. Prosecutor Pike drops case files with audible crash, understanding that his coordination with judicial bias faces federal criminal investigation under RICO statutes treating systematic corruption as organized crime. Private prison relationships, case fixing, and constitutional violations all documented for federal prosecution. Bailiff Whitlock steps backward from federal agent whose arrest would constitute federal crime under multiple statutes protecting law enforcement officers conducting constitutional investigation. His military training recognizes federal authority that trumps local judicial commands absolutely. Defense Attorney Cross stares at his client with growing amazement as he realizes her constitutional expertise resulted from federal law enforcement training, civil rights investigation experience, and months of preparation for this exact confrontation with systematic judicial corruption. Court reporter Hartwell continues typing with mechanical precision, documenting federal revelation that will become evidence in criminal prosecution of court officials who systematically violated constitutional rights under color of law. Every word matters now for federal grand jury consideration. Agent Crestwood produces federal warrant signed by U.S. District Judge Morrison, authorizing investigation into pattern or practice violations of federal civil rights law. Authentication procedures establish federal jurisdiction, legal authority, and constitutional supremacy that local officials cannot challenge through normal intimidation methods. This investigation includes financial relationships between local courts and private prison corporations. She continues with professional calm that terrifies everyone present. Federal RICO statutes treat systematic corruption as organized criminal conspiracy when it violates constitutional rights. The RICO reference reveals scope of federal investigation that extends beyond individual constitutional violations into organized corruption, requiring criminal prosecution under statutes designed for organized crime. Financial relationships with private prisons constitute federal criminal conspiracy when they influence sentencing decisions or constitutional protections. Judge Ashworth's face cycles through recognition, terror, and desperate calculation as he realizes the magnitude of federal law enforcement attention that his corruption has attracted. Decades of systematic bias face federal prosecution that could result in criminal conviction, career destruction, and federal imprisonment. Agent Crestwood, he begins with voice that reveals complete capitulation to federal authority. I was unaware that federal investigation was occurring in my courtroom. Your Honor, undercover federal investigations operate without suspect notification. Every constitutional violation committed during these proceedings has been documented for federal civil rights prosecution. The response establishes federal investigation authority while creating official record of constitutional violations that federal prosecutors will present to grand juries, considering criminal charges against court officials who systematically denied constitutional rights under color of law. Federal backup arrives through courtroom doors with precise timing that suggests coordinated law enforcement operation reaching culmination after months of investigation preparation. FBI agents, Justice Department attorneys, and federal marshals establish federal authority that supersedes local judicial power completely. Ladies and gentlemen, Agent Crestwood announces to courtroom gallery that has watched constitutional drama unfold. Federal investigation of this court system will continue under Justice Department authority. Constitutional violations documented during these proceedings will support federal civil rights prosecution. The announcement transforms local criminal proceeding into federal civil rights investigation that will reshape entire judicial district through constitutional accountability that corrupt officials cannot escape through local authority or procedural manipulation. Understanding your legal rights shouldn't require a law degree. With Masterclass, you can learn from legal experts, former FBI agents, and criminal justice professionals who break down complex legal concepts into understandable lessons. Whether you're interested in criminal justice, constitutional law, or investigative techniques, Masterclass offers world-class instruction from industry leaders. Right now, new subscribers get unlimited access to all classes for just $10 per month. Use our link below and start learning from the best minds in law enforcement and legal practice today. Federal takeover proceeds with mechanical efficiency that demonstrates months of preparation for this exact scenario. Justice Department protocols engage automatically as Agent Crestwood's investigation transitions from undercover documentation to active federal prosecution of systematic constitutional violations that require criminal accountability under federal law. Judge Ashworth's judicial authority evaporates as federal marshals assume control of courtroom operations under constitutional supremacy that local officials cannot challenge or resist. 30 years of unchecked power meet federal law enforcement that operates according to constitutional requirements regardless of local judicial preference. Court officials face choice between cooperation with federal investigation or additional criminal charges for obstruction of justice that could compound existing civil rights violations. Federal law provides clear incentives for cooperation while imposing severe penalties for continued resistance to constitutional accountability. Agent Crestwood produces recording device that has documented every constitutional violation, every moment of systematic bias, every word of judicial hostility toward federal rights that protect all Americans from government abuse of power. 3 months of evidence will support federal prosecution under multiple civil rights statutes. This device recorded complete audio of constitutional violations committed during systematic denial of civil rights, she announces while establishing chain of custody procedures required for federal criminal prosecution. Federal prosecutors will review every word for potential criminal charges. The recording revelation completes documentation requirements for federal civil rights prosecution, while establishing evidence preservation necessary for grand jury consideration of criminal charges against court officials who violated constitutional oaths through systematic bias and corruption. Federal investigation expands beyond individual constitutional violations into financial corruption, private prison relationships, and organized conspiracy that federal RICO statutes treat as criminal enterprise when it systematically violates constitutional rights for financial benefit. Justice Department attorneys begin evidence collection procedures that will support federal prosecution of judicial corruption, constitutional violations, and civil rights denial that has operated under color of law for decades, without federal accountability or constitutional protection for affected defendants. Federal investigation machinery operates with institutional weight that transforms local judicial system overnight as Justice Department Civil Rights Division implements constitutional accountability that corrupt officials cannot escape through traditional manipulation or intimidation. Agent Crestwood's months of undercover documentation provide foundation for systematic federal intervention that will reshape entire district. Preliminary federal findings emerge within hours as Justice Department attorneys review constitutional violations documented through Agent Crestwood's investigation. Pattern or practice evidence supports federal oversight, criminal prosecution, and court-imposed reform that operates independently of local judicial preference or political influence. Judge Beaumont Ashworth receives administrative leave notification that suspends judicial authority pending federal investigation completion. Suspension includes salary continuation but strips judicial power that enabled decades of constitutional violations through systematic bias and corruption coordination with private prison interests. Federal administrative leave preserves due process while protecting constitutional rights from continued violation. Agent Crestwood explains to media representatives who gather outside courthouse as the news of federal investigation spreads throughout legal community. Due process applies to everyone, including officials accused of systematically denying it to others. Court Clerk Meridian Blackwood faces federal questioning about financial arrangements, case coordination, and administrative procedures that enabled systematic constitutional violations. Her cooperation with federal investigation could reduce potential charges while exposure of corruption networks serves federal prosecution of organized conspiracy. Prosecutor Garrison Pike receives Justice Department notification that his case coordination with private prison interests constitutes federal criminal conspiracy under RICO statutes when it systematically violates constitutional rights for financial benefit. Federal prosecutors offer cooperation agreements in exchange for testimony about corruption network. Defense attorney Remington Cross experiences vindication as federal investigation validates constitutional concerns he rarely felt empowered to assert in hostile judicial environment. Federal protection allows attorneys to exercise constitutional advocacy without career retaliation from corrupt judicial and prosecutorial authorities. Bailiff Thorne Whitlock faces federal investigation of his role in intimidating defendants, suppressing constitutional challenges, and enabling systematic civil rights violations through physical threat and procedural manipulation designed to discourage assertion of federal rights. Court reporter Wren Hartwell provides critical evidence through stenographic records that document systematic constitutional violations, judicial bias, and organized resistance to federal civil rights law. Her accurate transcription enables federal prosecution of civil rights crimes that require precise documentation. Federal monitoring begins immediately as Justice Department Civil Rights Division implements oversight designed to prevent continued constitutional violations, while investigation proceeds toward criminal prosecution of systematic bias and corruption that operated under color of law. Community response reflects mixture of vindication and concern as residents realize their local judicial system operated outside constitutional constraints for decades, while federal protection remained distant until Agent Crestwood's investigation brought constitutional accountability to local operations. Federal investigation validates community concerns about systematic bias that affected hundreds of cases over decades. Local civil rights attorney Echo Riverside tells media representatives, "Constitutional protection shouldn't require federal intervention, but corrupt local authorities made federal action necessary. Private prison corporations face federal investigation of financial relationships with local judicial authorities that created systematic bias toward increased incarceration for minority defendants. Securities and Exchange Commission inquiry into stock manipulation through judicial corruption begins parallel investigation. Corbett Ironwood, CEO of Ashwood Correctional Corporation, receives federal subpoena for financial records, communication logs, and judicial coordination documents that federal investigators suspect constitute organized conspiracy to violate constitutional rights for corporate profit under RICO statutes. Federal grand jury convenes to consider criminal charges against court officials who systematically violated constitutional rights under color of law. Grand jury proceedings remain confidential, but constitutional violations documented through Agent Crestwood's investigation provide substantial evidence for federal prosecution. Justice Department press release announces pattern or practice investigation of entire Northern District of Alabama federal court system for systematic constitutional violations that affected hundreds of defendants over decades of organized bias and corruption coordination. But this isn't over. The documents that surface next week reveal an even bigger conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of government. If you want to see how deep this rabbit hole goes, subscribe and hit the bell, because the follow-up investigation uncovers corruption that will shock you to your core. What do you think happens to judges like this? Let me know below. Agent Crestwood transitions from undercover investigation to federal prosecution preparation as her documentation becomes evidence for criminal charges against systematic constitutional violation that operated as organized conspiracy under local judicial authority protected from federal oversight until constitutional challenges reached critical mass. Federal sentencing review begins for hundreds of cases affected by systematic bias documented through Agent Crestwood's investigation. Defendants who received enhanced sentences based on judicial bias face potential sentence reduction, conviction reversal, or complete case dismissal under federal constitutional protection. Appeals court oversight mechanisms activate automatically as federal investigation reveals systematic constitutional violations that require appellate intervention to protect federal rights from continued local judicial hostility. Circuit court supervision ensures constitutional compliance during transition period. Civil rights organizations file federal class action lawsuits seeking monetary damages for systematic constitutional violations that affected minority defendants throughout decades of organized judicial bias. Federal civil rights law provides individual compensation for constitutional violations committed under color of law. Legal education initiatives begin as federal investigation reveals widespread constitutional ignorance among local legal professionals who operated within systematically biased system without recognizing federal civil rights violations that required immediate correction under constitutional law. Law enforcement retraining programs implement federal constitutional requirements that local police ignored during coordination with biased judicial system. Federal oversight ensures constitutional compliance in arrest procedures, evidence collection, and defendant treatment that protects federal rights. Community healing processes begin as federal investigation validates decades of complaints about systematic judicial bias that local authorities dismissed without constitutional consideration. Federal protection enables community trust reconstruction through constitutional accountability. Prison reform initiatives examine systematic bias toward incarceration that federal investigation revealed through statistical analysis of sentencing patterns. Federal oversight ensures constitutional equality in judicial decisions that affect individual liberty and community safety. Federal monitoring continues indefinitely as Justice Department maintains oversight designed to prevent return of systematic constitutional violations that operated without federal accountability for decades. Constitutional protection requires permanent vigilance against organized bias and corruption. Media coverage expands beyond local interest as federal investigation reveals systematic constitutional violations that suggest broader pattern of judicial corruption, requiring national attention to constitutional protection mechanisms that safeguard federal rights from local governmental abuse. Legal precedent emerges from Agent Crestwood's investigation as federal courts establish constitutional requirements for judicial conduct, prosecutor coordination, and court administration that protects federal rights from systematic violation through organized bias and corruption. Professional consequences multiply as state bar associations investigate attorney conduct during systematic constitutional violations. Legal licenses face suspension or revocation for participation in organized denial of constitutional rights that federal law treats as criminal conspiracy. Financial recovery begins as federal investigation enables asset forfeiture, fine collection, and restitution payments that compensate victims of systematic constitutional violations while deterring future organized conspiracy to violate federal rights under color of law. Federal witness protection extends to community members who testified about systematic bias despite intimidation from corrupt judicial authorities. Federal law protects constitutional witnesses from retaliation while ensuring testimony availability for ongoing criminal prosecution. Constitutional education programs implement federal requirements throughout judicial district as investigation reveals systematic ignorance of federal rights that enable decades of constitutional violations. Education initiatives ensure constitutional compliance prevents future federal intervention necessity. International attention emerges as Agent Crestwood's investigation demonstrates American commitment to constitutional protection through federal law enforcement that holds local authorities accountable for systematic civil rights violations under color of law. Academic research begins as constitutional scholars study systematic judicial bias documented through federal investigation. Research findings contribute to national understanding of constitutional protection mechanisms that safeguard federal rights from organized governmental abuse. Legislative review considers federal law strengthening designed to prevent systematic constitutional violations that Agent Crestwood's investigation revealed throughout local judicial system. Congressional attention ensures federal protection remains adequate for constitutional rights preservation. Judicial reform initiatives implement federal oversight designed to prevent return of systematic constitutional violations while maintaining local judicial autonomy within constitutional constraints that protect federal rights from organized bias and corruption. But beneath apparent resolution, disturbing questions emerge about scope of corruption that Agent Crestwood's investigation has revealed. Federal evidence suggests systematic constitutional violations extend beyond local judicial system into higher levels of governmental authority that require additional investigation. Late evening after federal takeover, Agent Crestwood receives encrypted communication from unknown federal source suggesting her investigation has uncovered organized conspiracy that reaches constitutional crisis levels, requiring additional federal law enforcement attention beyond local judicial corruption. Agent Crestwood, anonymous federal voice, communicates through secure channel. Your investigation documented local operations of organized conspiracy that extends throughout federal court system. Constitutional violations you recorded suggest systematic corruption requiring national security attention. The communication reveals that local judicial corruption represents one component of organized conspiracy affecting constitutional protection throughout federal court system. Higher-level coordination requires investigation beyond Agent Crestwood's local documentation capabilities. Federal database access discovered in courthouse basement reveals electronic communication with federal appeals court judges, Supreme Court law clerks, and Justice Department officials that suggests constitutional crisis extending beyond local judicial bias into systematic federal corruption requiring national security investigation. Anonymous document delivery provides USB drive containing federal database access credentials, encrypted communication logs, and financial records that connect local judicial corruption to organized conspiracy affecting federal court system at constitutional crisis levels requiring immediate federal attention. Electronic surveillance evidence suggests federal appeals court coordination with private prison interests that systematically violates constitutional rights through organized conspiracy, extending beyond local judicial authority into federal appellate manipulation affecting Supreme Court case selection and constitutional interpretation. Intelligence community assessment reveals foreign influence operations targeting federal court system through financial corruption that Agent Crestwood's investigation inadvertently documented during local judicial bias investigation. Constitutional protection faces national security threats requiring immediate federal intervention. Federal protection relocates Agent Crestwood as her investigation attracts attention from organized conspiracy that extends beyond local judicial corruption into federal appellate coordination affecting constitutional protection at national security levels, requiring witness protection during ongoing investigation. Classified federal communication reveals Agent Crestwood's local investigation has documented evidence of organized conspiracy affecting constitutional protection throughout federal court system. Higher classification levels require investigation expansion beyond local judicial bias into systematic federal corruption. Congressional Oversight Committee receives classified briefing about Agent Crestwood's investigation revealing systematic constitutional violations that suggest organized conspiracy affecting federal court system at constitutional crisis levels requiring legislative attention to constitutional protection mechanisms. Justice Department internal investigation begins as Agent Crestwood's documentation reveals federal employee participation in organized conspiracy that systematically violates constitutional rights through coordination between local and federal judicial authorities requiring internal security investigation. Constitutional crisis emerges as federal investigation reveals systematic corruption affecting federal court system that threatens constitutional protection mechanisms through organized conspiracy, requiring national security attention beyond local judicial bias. Correction. Late-night phone call from Washington, D.C. interrupts Agent Crestwood's investigation transition as classified federal authority requests. Immediate briefing about evidence suggesting constitutional crisis requiring national security investigation beyond local judicial corruption documented through her undercover operation. Agent Crestwood, federal authority communicates through secure connection. Your investigation has documented local evidence of systematic federal corruption affecting constitutional protection at crisis levels. Immediate federal briefing required for national security investigation. The call reveals that systematic judicial bias represents component of larger organized conspiracy affecting constitutional protection throughout federal government. Agent Crestwood's local investigation has inadvertently uncovered evidence requiring national security attention. Encrypted federal database accessed through courthouse computer systems reveals communication between local judicial authorities and federal appellate courts that suggest systematic constitutional violation through organized conspiracy affecting Supreme Court case selection and federal constitutional interpretation. Federal surveillance evidence indicates organized conspiracy coordinates constitutional violations between local and federal judicial authorities through private prison financial relationships that systematically affect federal constitutional protection, requiring national security investigation beyond local judicial corruption. Anonymous federal source provides classified documentation suggesting Agent Crestwood's investigation has exposed organized conspiracy affecting constitutional protection at federal appellate and Supreme Court levels through systematic corruption requiring immediate national security attention. Federal witness protection protocols engage as Agent Crestwood's investigation attracts organized retaliation from conspiracy extending beyond local judicial authorities into federal appellate coordination affecting constitutional protection at national security crisis levels requiring immediate federal intervention. Constitutional emergency procedures begin as classified federal assessment reveals Agent Crestwood's local investigation has documented systematic federal corruption affecting constitutional protection through organized conspiracy, requiring national security investigation beyond normal Justice Department authority. The local victory against judicial corruption becomes prelude to constitutional crisis requiring federal law enforcement attention at national security levels, that Agent Crestwood's investigation has inadvertently revealed through documentation of systematic federal constitutional violations. Federal grand jury expansion occurs as Agent Crestwood's evidence reveals organized conspiracy affecting federal constitutional protection through systematic coordination between local and federal judicial authorities, requiring investigation beyond normal federal criminal prosecution authority. National security classification applies to Agent Crestwood's investigation as federal assessment reveals systematic constitutional violations affect federal court system through organized conspiracy, requiring investigation beyond normal constitutional protection mechanisms. But in quiet moment after federal intervention, Agent Crestwood opens personal file containing birth certificate, adoption records, and family photographs that reveal final truth about her investigation motivation. The corruption she documented affected more than constitutional rights. It destroyed her family. Valora Crestwood's employment records show court stenographer position terminated after reporting judicial bias that threatened private prison financial arrangements. Her subsequent blacklisting from federal court system eliminated career opportunities while pregnancy complicated survival prospects for single mother. Medical records reveal Valora Crestwood's death resulted from inadequate healthcare access after judicial retaliation eliminated employment opportunities. Systematic corruption didn't just violate constitutional rights, it killed the mother who tried to protect them. Agent Indigo Crestwood closes personal file as federal investigation transitions toward national security crisis requiring constitutional protection beyond personal justice. Her mother's death motivated investigation that exposed systematic corruption threatening constitutional protection for all Americans. Federal protection ensures Agent Crestwood's safety as investigation expands beyond local judicial corruption into organized conspiracy affecting constitutional protection at national crisis levels, requiring investigation beyond normal federal law enforcement capabilities. The courthouse lights dim as federal agents secure evidence that will support investigation of systematic constitutional violations extending beyond local judicial bias into organized conspiracy affecting federal constitutional protection at national security crisis levels, requiring immediate federal attention. Agent Crestwood drives through Montgomery streets where her mother once walked, carrying federal evidence of constitutional crisis that began with local judicial corruption but extends throughout federal court system, threatening constitutional protection for every American citizen. Her investigation achieved local justice through federal constitutional protection, but evidence suggests larger constitutional crisis requiring investigation beyond individual victory against systematic judicial bias. The fight for constitutional protection continues at national security levels, requiring federal law enforcement attention. Federal investigation continues as systematic constitutional violations documented through Agent Crestwood's undercover operation expand into organized conspiracy affecting federal constitutional protection at crisis levels, requiring national security investigation beyond normal constitutional protection mechanisms. The local courthouse fades in rearview mirror as Agent Crestwood carries evidence of constitutional crisis toward federal headquarters, where investigation will expand beyond individual judicial corruption into systematic threat to constitutional protection, requiring national security attention. Constitutional protection requires eternal vigilance against organized conspiracy that Agent Crestwood's investigation revealed through documentation of systematic federal corruption affecting constitutional rights at national crisis levels, requiring immediate federal law enforcement attention beyond local judicial bias correction. But some secrets remain buried in encrypted federal databases that Agent Crestwood's investigation inadvertently accessed, revealing constitutional crisis extending beyond judicial corruption into systematic threat requiring investigation at national security classification levels. The truth about constitutional protection in America requires investigation beyond Agent Crestwood's documented evidence into classified federal corruption affecting constitutional rights through organized conspiracy at national security crisis levels, requiring immediate federal attention.